Good morning, and welcome to the Working Person's Pundit. I'm your host, Don, and we're on our way to work today. And I wanted to thank everyone for tuning into the show and making it what it was. Our last broadcast on our humble commute got us about 1,500 views on Real Progressives and another 1,000 and change in other groups. So thanks so much for tuning in and making this what it is. So today we're talking about something that came up in the election, and it came up a lot of times, and it's something that in recent years at least hasn't been a big deal, and that's Russia. Russia. We heard coming from the DNC this constant denunciation of Russia and what they were doing. And so I wanted to spend a little time to talk about Russia, who they are, what they're doing, and particularly how it pertains to this whole election situation. So let's start out with a professor. He's a great guy. I recommend that you check his work. His name is Stephen Cohen. He is a professor emeritus at Princeton University, and he's his entire life talking about and studying Russia, and this is him on CNN talking about the DNC hack. Let's have a listen to what he has to say.
Vladimir Putin wants to end the new Cold War, and so do I. Let me say I have no ties. I tried on the way down here. I couldn't fit it on the front page, but it would go like this. We're in a new and more dangerous Cold War with Russia. We're approaching a Cuban Missile Crisis nuclear confrontation with Russia, both along Russia's borders and possibly over Syria. There is absolutely no discussion, no debate about this in the American media, including, forgive me, on CNN. Then along comes unexpectedly Donald Trump, who says something that suggests he wants to end the new Cold War, cooperate with Russia in various places, what we used to call détente. And now, astonishingly, the media is full of what only can be called neo-McCarthyite charges that he's a Russian agent, that he's a Manchurian candidate, that he's Putin's client. So the real danger is what's being done to our own political process. This is a moment when there should be, in a presidential year, a debate, because Mrs. Clinton's position on Russia seems to be very different, has been a long time. Trump speaks elliptically. You got to piece together what he says, but he seems to want a new American policy toward Russia. And considering the danger, I think we as American citizens deserve that debate and not what will be given in the media today, including on the front page of the New York Times. I end by saying that these reckless branding of Trump as a Russian agent, most of it is coming from the Clinton campaign, and they really need to stop.
Okay, I don't know.
So there you have it. He completely blows the CNN anchor out of the water with his policy on Russia. So he talks about the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was born in the 70s, and as a kid, we always worried about there being a nuclear war with the Soviet Union because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So let's give a little background on what the Cuban Missile Crisis was. It started with Cuba. Prior to 1958, Cuba was run by basically an oligarch, a very, very corrupt guy called Batista, who basically ran the country with an iron hand, prevented any free media from being out there, a real oligarch. Cuba was a place where people from the East Coast, primarily New York, up and down the Florida Panhandle, even as high up as Washington, they would go to Cuba for the weekend. They'd fly down there, and the enticements in Cuba were gambling, prostitution, and drugs and alcohol. Also, Cuba exported sugar and exported rum. They were one of our biggest clients. Now, in 1958, Fidel Castro did the Cuban Revolution and overthrew Batista, took over the country, and privatized all those industries. That has been a sore spot for American industry as well as Cuban Americans who live in Florida, most of them, ever since 1958. And then Cuba went towards Russia in order to survive. In 1962, a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba found the presence of nuclear missiles, as well as launch apparatus. And they also saw ships coming in, bringing more nuclear missiles to Cuba. Now, intercontinental ballistic missiles weren't yet really mature in those days, so these short-range missiles were very important because they could reach anywhere in the United States. They could reach Washington, probably within 2 to 3 minutes would be the fly time. And you compare that with an ICBM that had to come all the way from Russia, which they didn't even have very good ones in '62, and it was a huge threat to the United States. So the United States, that was when they came closest to war. What happened is they put a blockade around all of Cuba, and then Cuba shot down a U-2 spy plane. We went to DEFCON 2. At DEFCON 1, we're in nuclear war. We had scrambled all the fighter planes. We had pulled in all the reserves. I mean, it really looked like we were going to have a nuclear war with Russia, and then miraculously, because of John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev, who was the Russian premier in those days, they were able to solve the situation and sort of very quietly de-escalate. One of the conditions was that the United States remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey as well as from Italy. And then the Americans also agreed to leave Cuba alone, to leave Castro alone. And so that was the Cuban Missile Crisis that Professor Cohen was just talking about in a nutshell. It was the closest in our lifetime that we know about that we came to nuclear war. Now he's talking about a new and more dangerous Cold War, and the reason why it's more dangerous is because back in the original Cold War, you had all of these satellite states that acted as a buffer for the Soviet Union. So you had Poland, you had all the Warsaw Pact countries, but ever since the end of the Cold War and the Bush administration, we have pushed the boundaries of NATO closer and closer to Russia. So whereas before the boundaries of NATO were like in East Berlin, quite away from Moscow, now they are right on the borders of Russia, and we also have this proxy war in Syria, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. So when it comes to the issue of Russia, you really cannot separate Syria from the Russian conflict right now, because Russia is the country that is backing the Syrian Assad regime. So let's look at the rest of the clip from this gentleman, where he talks more about the narrative that's being pushed in the media about Russia being this big boogeyman.
And why does it not all fit with the headline in today's New York Times, which says Russian spies said to hack Clinton's bid?
Said to have. That's not news. That's an allegation. James Clapper. I don't know who hacked. Everybody hacks everybody. I mean, we hacked into Chancellor Merkel's cell phone. We learned that from Snowden. The Israelis hacked. The Americans hacked. The Chinese hacked. Everybody hacked. The point is that, and I know you said it not to defend it, but as a provocation, that let's take the position you just set out, that Putin wants to end the independence of Baltic states. There's no evidence for that. None whatsoever. The point is that on the networks, and I'm not blaming CNN, there's none on any network. There's none in the New York Times. I'm old enough to remember that during the last Cold War, all these issues were debated in that you had a proponent of each point of view. But you've now got accusations both against Putin, both against Trump, which needed to be debated. Let's go back to what you said, that Trump said about NATO. Trump said early on he wanted to know, 60 years after its foundation, what was NATO's mission today. 100 policy walks in Washington since the end of the Soviet Union, 25 years ago, have asked the same question. Is NATO an organization in search of a mission? For example, its mission for the last 20 years has to expand ever closer to Russia. So people have now asked, why isn't it fighting international terrorism? That's a legitimate question. But we don't debate it. We don't ask it. We just say, oh, Trump wants to abandon NATO. I don't defend Trump. Trump raises questions. And instead of giving an answer to the substance of the question, we denounce him as some kind of Kremlin agent. That's bad for our politics, but still
Okay,
worse.
well, he hasn't.
Given the danger, we're not addressing it.
So there you go. Now, what I find very interesting about that clip is that you notice that the guy who's the CNN guy has got all this Hillary stuff behind him. So he pretty much shows his hand in terms of who he's supporting and what he's supporting. But he talks about there being more danger than in the Cold War. And that is something which is pretty important, because we forget, we're trying to demonize Putin, we're saying he's horrible, all this type of stuff, the media is. We forget actually who Putin is and what Putin has done. The Russian state, the Russian country is a very ancient country. It's the largest country by land mass in the world, still is. It is a country that completely collapsed 2 times in the last 100 years. Once in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, where the whole country descended into chaos, and then once again in the early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Putin, Vladimir Putin, if you want to understand him, you have to understand that his goal is actually to prevent it from collapsing a 3rd time. Some people say, as we're about to listen to in this clip, that there exists unbridled ambition, that he wants to be a new Hitler and go and do all of these things. I disagree with that. I don't think that Putin is any angel, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But one of the things that we forget about Putin, which is a really important thing that no one talks about, certainly this guy on CNN doesn't, but when we had 9/11, when those planes flew into the towers and blew up 3,000 people, Putin called George W. Bush, the president at the time, and said, "I'm sorry for what has happened to you. I'm going to help you." And the Russians had been in Afghanistan and still had forward bases of operation in Afghanistan, and they went in there and did some of the initial targeting. They did some of the scout work. They had some of their own people killed. So there's actually a mother in the United States today who has a son who is in the army, or a daughter who came home to them because Putin's Russian forces, after 9/11, went in and did the dirty work in Afghanistan because they felt sympathy. And they were hoping, Putin was hoping, that the result of that would be that the United States would stop expanding NATO all the way to the borders of Russia. But instead of doing that, we brought in additional countries into NATO. All of these little countries that used to be satellites, Poland and many, many others. But the hot spot right now, which is very dangerous, is this war in Syria, this proxy war in Syria. And I want to take a minute to listen to this clip of Hillary Clinton talking at the debate about a no-fly zone.
In power. So when I was Secretary of State, advocated, and I advocate today, a no-fly zone and safe zones. We need some leverage with the Russians because they're not going to come to the negotiating table for a diplomatic resolution unless there is some leverage over them. And we have to work more closely with our partners and allies on the ground. But I want to emphasize that what is at stake here is the ambitions and the aggressiveness of Russia. Russia has decided that it's all in Syria.
President, I've said myself, we will not send American combat troops back to either Syria or Iraq. That is off the table. But we do have special forces. We do have trainers. We do have military personnel who are helping with the airstrikes that the United States is leading so that we can try to take out ISIS infrastructure, take out their leadership. And I think that given the threat that ISIS poses to the region and beyond, as we have sadly seen in our own country, it is important to keep.
So in that clip, she talks about how we really need to check Russia. We need to set up a no-fly zone. We need to not have boots on the ground. And this is something where people just listen to it, and unfortunately we were like, yeah, she said no boots on the ground, but a no-fly zone. Well, those two things are in complete opposition with one another. Why? Because if you set up a no-fly zone, how do you enforce it? You enforce it many ways, but at least two of the ways require boots on the ground, because you need radar stations on the ground underneath where the no-fly zone is to see. You need missile batteries that are staffed by men, by special forces, and then you need people guarding the missile batteries. And then you're flying planes over every day. So the idea that we're just going to have a no-fly zone but no boots on the ground is just not accurate. They are attempting to rely on the fact that most of us are so busy driving back and forth from work, we don't take time to actually think about what these things actually mean. And when you enforce a no-fly zone over Syria or any country, it requires boots on the ground. There's no way around it, and it requires massive logistical support. So what you see here is a proxy war coming up in Syria, and it has to do with oil, because there's a pipeline which was proposed from Qatar through Syria to Europe, and there was another pipeline from Iran through Syria to Europe. Russia supports the Iranian pipeline, and the United States supports the other pipeline. And right now, in the energy market in Europe, Putin has a lot of influence because they're one of the largest suppliers of oil and natural gas to Western and Eastern Europe, because they have massive oil reserves. So the war is a proxy war over oil. It's also about United States influence. And even our allies in the region, Israel, doesn't want us going in and messing up Syria. Why? Because the Assad regime, supported by Russia, and the Iranians, I mean, they're not perfect, and there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of threats to Israel and other interest in the area. But at least it's not going to turn into a hellhole like Iraq has turned into, and the way that Libya has turned into. The whole refugee crisis that we have in Europe right now is a result of failed American policy, where we went and blew up those countries, destroyed everyone's livelihood, and that's the reason why you have terrorists. They don't have anything to live for. They're sitting there. Somebody shows up and says, here's $30,000, we'll take care of your family, and go and blow yourself up. Now, this reckless pushing towards a no-fly zone is something which is very dangerous and would lead us directly into war. And here I'd like to play a little clip from Tulsi Gabbard, who supported Bernie Sanders within the primaries, and she's talking about Clinton's warmongering foreign policy that could potentially have led us into conflict with Russia. Now, we don't know if Trump's going to be any better. I suppose that he won't be, because of the fact that our foreign policy is driven by a security apparatus which the president really has limited control over, and is very dangerous for them to go against. But this is what Tulsi Gabbard had to say.
Take another step forward. If she says she's learned from Iraq, then why is she championing this war to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad, and essentially promising to escalate that war if she's elected as president by implementing a so-called no-fly zone? And you've questioned Secretary Clinton on this issue of the no-fly zone and the fact that taking this action would put us directly in conflict with Russia, and what the implications of that will be. So again, this is why the issue of judgment is so critical, and how Hillary and Bernie very.
So there you go. The issue of judgment is very critical, and if you escalate in Syria, it would potentially put you directly into conflict with Russia, and that's something that's not just her opinion, it's also some of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's opinion. Let's listen to what he had to say in a briefing.
Available to the president. What about the option of controlling the airspace so that barrel bombs cannot be dropped?
All the options.
What do you think of that option, sir?
Right now, Senator, for us to control all of the airspace in Syria would require us to go to war against Syria and Russia. That's a pretty fundamental decision that certainly I'm not going to make.
So here you see these senators, these Republican senators, who are just itching for a war. And since that came out, there has been some situations where Russian jets have flown into Turkish airspace and been shot down. There's been other situations where convoys with Russian advisors were bombed by quote-unquote NATO, which is a euphemism for American planes. And this is dangerous because before the Russians were operating on their own. Now the Russians are operating with the backing of the Chinese. And there's a bunch of warmongers in the United States who believe that we should be out there fighting at every turn, attempting to secure our empire throughout the world. And that is unsustainable, particularly when you think about the fact that wars are very, very expensive to fight. And the last war which we fought, we didn't have the money for it, so we had to get money from China. But now in this situation, China is backing Russia, and in response to the escalation and the incursions and the bombings, Russia deployed the world's most sophisticated missile defense system called the A-400, which we're going to see a little clip about here. And this is something that can potentially shoot down stealth fighters, and it's far more sophisticated than the Patriot system. It's more sophisticated than the Iron Dome system that Israel uses, and it has a range that would allow it to completely defend the skies over Syria. And the Russians came out and said, hey, we see something coming. We're not sure if it's NATO or otherwise. We're just going to shoot it down. Let's look at this missile system.
Planes, helicopters, and even missiles, you name it. The S-400 Triumph can locate and hunt down almost any flying target.
First, the target is spotted and identified. Then the system starts monitoring it, or following its course. Then the command makes the call to either eliminate the target or not. After getting the green light, the system opens fire.
One of the strong suits of the system is its mobility. It can literally create full-scale air defense anywhere on the ground within minutes.
Preparation takes not more than 5 minutes, and everything's done by 3 people, 1 officer and 2 conscripting soldiers.
The system can shoot down objects as small as a soccer ball, even if they're flying at supersonic speeds. Each S-400 system consists of several elements. One radar, which monitors the skies looking for targets, a second one, which follows specific targets, a command post, and the launcher itself, or the gun, as it's called here in the Army. Combined, the elements of the system can follow up to 300 targets, flying from as low as just a few feet above ground and up to nearly 40 miles high in the skies, which is pretty much around 6 times higher than the average passenger.
So the A-400 missile system was deployed to Syria in order to potentially shoot down any hostile aircrafts, which essentially were NATO or American aircrafts. So why are we even talking about this? We're talking about this because the wrong posture in that part of the world can lead us into potentially World War III. The Russians have the backing of the Chinese. They've got the Iranians backing. We have, and let's say that we do prevail. We take them out. What happens then? Does Assad become another, does Syria become another Iraq? That would be horrible. Does Syria become another Libya? That would be horrible. Clinton's little private war. I mean, the very scary thing is that you have a military-industrial complex which supported Clinton largely. 5 out of 6 of the world's biggest weapons conglomerates gave exclusively to Clinton. Did they give because they want to promote world peace? They gave because they want war. And we have huge problems in our country. I'm driving down the streets. It's bumpy. It's like a third world country. No one has health care, and yet we're spending 60+%, 70% of our budget promoting war. And in the last war that we had, we relied on Chinese to buy U.S. Treasury bonds to support it, but they're not going to do it this time around. So when you talk about that, a lot of people immediately switch to identity politics. I was having a conversation the other day with someone online who was saying, you mean you're defending Putin? You're defending Putin. You're defending Putin. Putin's a bad guy. So the conversation isn't really, is Putin a good guy or is Putin a bad guy? The conversation is, what are the implications of going head-to-head with somebody like Putin? They're very dangerous. And Putin is probably trying to, protect his national interest. That's what heads of states do, the same way that the United States attempts to protect their national interests. But people just become blind. Putin's bad. He's a fascist. He executes gay people. He doesn't have a free press in his country. All those things are true. I'm not going to deny them. I wouldn't survive very long in Putin's Russia. But there's a lot of things that we need Putin for. For example, in Russia, they have 25 million people there who are Muslims. So, and they border all of these Muslim countries or Muslim country adjacent places. If we are going to fight terror, if we're serious about fighting ISIS, which we're not, we just use it as a propaganda point. But if we are serious about it, we need Putin. We can't have Russia falling into chaos. They have more incidents of radical Islamic terrorism in Russia than we ever have because of the massive Muslim population there. So we need them as a partner and not to alienate them if we're serious about tackling that threat and we're not just building it up to be a boogie person. But I want to get back to this issue of the hypocrisy of the United States. So, for example, we're very quick to say, oh my God, he's executing gay people, he's doing all this horrible stuff. And that's true. He's doing all those things. But we are complete hypocrites. Why? Because who are our greatest allies in the area? Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the most brutal country probably in the world. I mean, you go from Saudi Arabia to Russia, and you just think that, Russia was planet freedom compared to the Saudi Arabians. Let's look at this little clip from On Contact with Chris Hedges, where he talks with an author who's worked very extensively in Saudi Arabia, and she talks about how tough the conditions are on the ground there.
Let's talk about Saudi society, which you spend quite a bit of time in the book speaking about. Give us a profile of what Saudi Arabia is like.
One of the most repressive countries in the world, where there is no freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, no political parties, no unions allowed, where dissent is treated as treason. You can be beheaded for insulting Islam, for insulting the king, for spreading atheism, for being convicted of being a homosexual, for sorcery. Right. There is discrimination against entire groups of people, like women, who are not only forced to fully cover in public, and the only country where women aren't allowed to drive, but a guardianship system where women have to have a male legal guardian from the day they're born to the day they die.
You call it gender apartheid.
Gender apartheid. It's the most sex-segregated society in the world. Immigrant population,
which we should be clear is huge.
Huge. Of a 30 million population, 10 million are migrant workers, many of whom are coming from some of the poorest countries in the world and are treated like indentured servants.
Talk about how they're treated, which you do speak about in detail in the book.
Well, first, let's say slavery was only eliminated in 1962 in Saudi Arabia, and with this huge oil money that has flooded the country, many people, including middle-class Saudis, have use the money to bring in foreign workers, and it's a sponsorship program. You can't just say, oh, I'm from a poor country in Bangladesh, I'm going to go try my luck in Saudi Arabia. You have to have a sponsor, and the sponsor then becomes like your owner. You couldn't even leave the country if you don't get permission from your employer, and you're treated like an indentured servant.
And you have no redress if you're abused.
You have no redress, you have no ability to fight back, you have, the only thing you can do is try to contact your embassy, and good luck if they're going to come to your help. And even though it's become illegal, Saudi employers still take passports.
And they're worked 15 hours a day. Wage theft, sexual abuse of women is very common.
I mean, since there are no ways to monitor how you're treated in somebody's home, all kinds of abuses, and I tell some of the horrific examples.
So there you go. Putin's bad, but Saudi Arabia is great. We gotta fight Putin, but we're gonna sell arms to Saudi Arabia. See, this is the hypocrisy. When you try to have a conversation about what's going on, people just get brainwashed with the propaganda that comes out of the television, and they never talk about that. When was the last show on CNN that talked about indentured servants or us selling hundreds of billions of dollars of arms to Saudi Arabia so that they can bomb Yemen? So I'm not making the point that Putin's great or that Russia's great, but they could be a partner. They're an important partner. And at the very least, you don't want to engage in military adventurism, first of all, because it's the wrong thing to do. And secondly, because we have so many huge problems at home. This doesn't make us any safer. This doesn't make us any better. This is very reckless and dangerous actions on the part of the United States. And I hope that it stops. I'm not hopeful that it will. But at the very least, as we watch it, as we talk to our congresspersons, as we think about this stuff, we need to be informed. And that's the goal of the Working Person's Pundit and partnering with Real Progressives. I want to thank everyone for watching. Let's try to get this video to have as many views as possible. And you'll be surprised. I think this time next year, we're going to have a much larger reach. These videos that get 2,000 views might be getting 200,000 views. That's my goal. And so I want to thank you for riding along with me. If you have questions or comments, or you disagree with any of this stuff, please put them below the video. I look at all those comments, and I'm going to talk about them in the next video. In the meantime, thank you for watching the Working Person's Pundit and joining me on my ride to work. No crashes today. I'll see you next time.